Hello everyone, today we talk about 9th century Eastern Francia, or Francia if you prefer. We never made a video specifically on the Eastern Frankish kingdom in Carolingian times. Today we essentially introduce the reign of Louis the German, what was the Eastern Frankish kingdom at the time in terms of the ethnic political composition, the relation with the other Carolingian realms that at this point, as you know, were split essentially among the children of Louis the Pious. The importance of the ecclesiastical policy in the kingdom, which were the most important centers, right? The routes of communication, what was the sort of political and territorial stability of a realm that had actually not previously existed up to this point, and that wouldn't fully consolidate before the 11th or the 12th century as something like more than a cluster of, in fact, ethnic duchies for good. And we will also look at how the Eastern Francia was affected by the Lotharingia, the struggle for the Lotharingian succession, actually before the death of Lothar II, which exemplifies how, even after the Treaty of Verdun, and in fact there would be actually other important treaties that normally in school books you tend to skip, right? But the Carolingians were not content just with what happened in 842-43, but in fact were conceived mostly like temporary condition for which all these rulers were not really looking at their portions of the empire as something, well, okay, you know, from now on, these realms have been formed and will be content with us. No, they wanted to, of course, reunite the empire as tradition dictates, right? Except they would fail in doing so. But it was a gradual process, something that I think the reign of Louis the German well exemplifies, right? The awareness of the imperial unity, as opposed to this also local regional, let's say, necessities of government. So it's important to characterize the same Eastern Frankish kingdom as such. You know, what was this, right? Essentially, up to this time in history, this essentially central, in part Western European territory had not existed as a polity, but even as a nation per se, right? There were, of course, important divides within the Carolingian Empire between the Romans, the Germanic areas. Just the other day, I made a video about the Duchy of Brabant that illustrates that as a frontier, say, linguistic frontier area. And it's interesting how we videos get so easily interconnected in a short distance in time from one another. Meaning, after all, we're not talking about all the same things, but many things come always back so easily. But it was rather a matter of political integrity within the systems, as we will see now. And paradoxically, to an extent, if you look at especially 10th century history, the Western Frankish kingdom was much more politically and culturally unitary, at least in terms of that participation in the hierarchy, than the Eastern Frankish kingdom, right? That area was sort of more homogeneous, you can argue, in as much as there were perhaps less differences within the Germanic area as opposed to, for example, northern and southern Gaul, right? But this actually is an illusion. I mean, it is true in absolute terms, but in relative terms, as far as those duchies saw themselves regarding to one another, and especially for the fact that they had always been divided, there had never been a unity of those ethnic polities that had essentially continued within the Carolingian order. There was really no sense of union, right? What was this Eastern Frankish kingdom? Essentially, only the person of the sovereign gave unity to that, right? This was a traditional perspective. You have all these different territories, parts of which had been historically colonized by the Franks, since in part, the part of these territories were also part of the Frankish homeland. But speaking of the actual basis of power, like in the late further west, like the Merovingians had been colonizing Germany since the beginning, right? Entering especially as far as the Main Valley is concerned into a territory that the Romans, as you know, had essentially failed to colonize in the long run. Others that had been conquered brutally, traumatically by Charlemagne. Think about Saxony and how this had somehow engineered, and this was actually the big. Today we don't talk about the Stellinger revolt, but you know that the Carolingians had been molding a very peculiar social order and political hierarchy, right, to control these territories in many ways. Other territories had been part of more compact polities, such as the Duchy of Bavaria, that had been historically a Frankish creation from the migration era. They had lacked like the same, perhaps this broader area, especially in the southeast of Germany, was sort of the more ethnically composite, right? Remember that the lands on the right bank of the Danube historically had been Celtic, Roman, right? Plus the Slavs had entered an important part of in fact, these Germanic duchies in the center, in the south. The emerging of a Teutonic nation that we will discuss in another video was just kicking in and starting from essentially an elite and strongly Christian monastic standpoint, right, in the great abbeys of St. Gall, right, or Fulda, that were starting to use this terminology to support, of course, the Carolingian government in seeing as this partition of the empire as a kingdom on its own, not simply the lands of the Eastern Franks. These lands were in fact not, not even majoritarily Frankish. There were different peoples, the Saxons, the Lotharingians, the Bavarians, the Alamanni, and so on. And I made multiple videos about each of these peoples, both for the migration era and the later Middle Ages. So if you're interested, you can always check that out in the Medieval Germany playlist or Migration Era playlist, depending on what you're interested in. So you can argue that politically this land as a whole, it was quite extended by the way, did not have any tradition of its own. And as such, it was a great struggle to sort of keep it together. This was the most important worry of the Carolingians, not to make this territorial system collapse, right? In many ways, the Franks had been very successful in conquering Germany. Again, not even Rome had succeeded in this, especially the Saxons that were the most resistant people to the conquest would turn out to be the most successfully, imperial one, of course, in the 10th century. As you know, that's also a long story, but have an Ottonian playlist for that as well. And this initial fragmentation, lack of cohesion, was evident at many levels of the Eastern Frankish administration. For example, the army, right? You would realize that there wasn't such like an identity of an Eastern Frankish people and armed force, but essentially just a collection of contingents from what they consider themselves as individual peoples, right? We will realize now what these were, because even the notion that the ethnic duchies were that sort of well outlined is not entirely true, right? In some cases, it is, especially in those territories that had been part of the Frankish Empire from quite a long time, such as Alamannia, right? But when you look at the Saxons, you look at the Lotharingians, etc., you realize that more than single peoples, these were still considering themselves as different, tribes within a broader group that, yes, was taking shape, that was historically, especially in Germany, still divided so geographically by major, as intricate forests, right, that made even contact, even linguistically, like sort of difficult for these groups to actually communicate with one another, right? And so to develop something bigger, again, the colonization of Germany would undergo for a very long time. The Ostsiedlung, in a sense, is started from the same west across Germany during these centuries. And so this was complicated by the relative lack of surplus. This was essentially the least developed of what became the post-Carolingian kingdoms. There were scarce resources. The land was more sparsely populated, and so trying to establish a stronger, concentrated power was more complicated. The nobility of the various duchies had, however, especially under the Franks, began to seize the opportunity of cooptation, in other words, increasing their power, being supplied, being supported by the Carolingian rulers in order to gain more control over their own peoples, that in this sense were not particularly happy. Again, there would be a major rebellion of the freemen, actually multiple ones, that would ally themselves traditionally with the slaves, because they realized that they would have soon lost a great part of their liberty in becoming de facto serfs, to an extent that in Germany is very evident. I made a video about Conrad II, just a couple of centuries later, explaining what Germany really was at that point, also from a social point of view. And it was thus from the nobility that the greatest need to express the existence of these ethnic duchies as fundamentally provinces of this Eastern Frankish kingdom would stem from. The concept of patria, right, so the equivalent of fatherland, was fostered, of course, at the courts of these lords that realized that essentially if they wanted to play the big game in the empire for their status, fundamentally on a local level, they would have had to compact, right? And this also meant essentially becoming an ever more detached group from the lower strata of the population that were to rather sustain, just like it happened in the Frankish world, properly meant their own military exploit, essentially the development of a military class. I made a video recently about the development of Carolingian cavalry in the 8th century, but the process, of course, refers a bit also to the following ones, and in any case I have many videos about the seigneurial era that explains this, right? And the very presence of the ministeriales in Germany begins at this point, from the serfs that were just at this point not even militarized administrators, but that would sort of become, as long as they increase power under the lords' government. And so lots of stuff goes on. I have made some videos about, for example, the Eliand, explaining a bit also the ideology that the Carolingians were imposing in this mechanism, going in parallel with evangelization, and so how this had to strengthen a sense of political cooperation at the higher levels of the empire. Again, if you think that the Ottonians, like the Saxons, would be the ones that would champion eventually the Renaissance Imperium, you realize how, at the end of the day, incredibly successful this thing was, right? How civilizationally impacting, after all, those wars, those bloodsheds, those, the social engineering had actually been for the future of this very lands, at least in some parts of their history. So the sense of patria applied to the Eastern Frankish realm as a whole instead was very far from being accepted. Again, the local nobility simply did not care about this because, say, I don't know, the Alamanni had a completely different interest, at least to some extent, than compared to the Saxons or to the Bavarians. So at that provincial level, a common identity, an elite one, began to rise, whereas an Eastern Frankish one overall was still pretty vague. And so for the simple reason that, as we'll see now, the same Carolingian rulers were actually trying to go back to a single empire. So also these divisions were provisory in many ways. I mean, it's easy for us today to identify in these groups the following, like national development. If you think about the Eastern Franks, you think about the Germans. They're not quite the same thing, really, because the thing was being molded at this point, and just territorially, the country was different. For Western Francia, of course, the France, right? But we shouldn't absolutely, when it comes to Carolingian history, reasoning in a teleological and deterministic fashion for which let's say, for example, the partition of the territorial partition of the Carolingian Empire at the time of Verdun was simply based on, say, a linguistic divide. Right? That wasn't the case. If anything, leave aside Lotharingia, is in fact the more problematic, even just presenting this picture. But in general, when you realize how these lands were partitioned, there was some sort of sense of practicality, right, politically based on also the linguistic, cultural affinity of some kind. So some aspects could not even be even that flattering. Again, the fact that the Eastern Frankish kingdom was sort of the toughest to keep together. There were strategic considerations, enemies at the frontier. There were logistical issues, but all was fundamentally functional to the eventual reunion of the empire, which would even happen at the end of the imperial Carolingians, under, in fact, the Saint Louis the German's son, Charles III, right, emperor, right, Roman emperor. And so the peoples that inhabited this area were still reasoning in ways that we would like to know much better, but that evidently were also thinking from a local perspective that maybe this order could end, right? Everything was by now safely in the hands of the nobility, but again, at the provincial level, right? If it was a centrifugal option for them, like to move out to gain more autonomy, that would happen. Of course, the Carolingian conquest had changed everything. These lands were now for good Christianized and part of a much bigger system. And of course, that's what kept them together to an important extent, because this provided with great opportunities for those who ruled them as well. When you look at both the lay nobility and the clergy, you realize that, in fact, they didn't really care about the frontiers drawn in 842-43, right? They especially didn't feel like they were united. Again, this is very different from the Western Frankish nobility that, yes, could have great divides. Gaul was bigger, more populated, and so also more different within it, but it was more developed to the point that at the Treaty of Coulennes in 843, the Western Frankish establishment could sort of recognize itself within that system, because they understood what kind of greater options there would be, right? And leave aside the fact that, again, the Western Frankish kingdom would fragment politically much more later. That's true politically, but it's not really true in terms of gluing factor that kept these aristocracies feeling as part of the Western Frankish kingdom, right? In the Eastern Frankish kingdom, this would take a much longer time, right? The ethnic duchies would remain essentially the main identity compass until, again, the 11th to 12th century. And even after that, they didn't kid either, right? But there was another situation politically, internationally, so and locally as well, for them to have developed already into something else, as chunks of a true kingdom that, even in their own specificities were working within that, right? And they couldn't quite sort of escape it, even when they were very autonomous and in some cases just more distant, even politically, from monarchic power. In fact, there was a distinct fear in the 9th century that this Eastern Frankish kingdom would not last, right? And consider that until the 10th century, like especially during the Magyar invasions, the sense is that areas like Saxony, Thuringia, Bavaria could be destabilized politically to a point of collapse, right? And so that frontier of the civilized world would shrink to essentially the Rhineland, which had been, after all, the main sort of area of expansion of the same Franks, and that in fact had been had brought to the same conquest of these eastern lands, because as being productive, it didn't need foreign peoples harassing it in the east, like the Saxons, for example, had been doing for hundreds of years, right? Everybody was playing their own card, if you want. So one has to appreciate, of course, the accomplishment that in 200-300 years the Eastern Frankish kingdom achieved regarding its political and institutional consolidation. But sticking to Carolingian times and Louis the German's reign specifically, we realize actually that this was a fairly stable time in itself, right? There weren't major feuds among the nobility under Louis' reign, right? After his death, rather, they would become more frequent. This is true also chronologically for the other Carolingian lands, right? The system was falling apart, so these children of Louis the Pious were after all keeping things together, in as much as even they, during their competition, like the latter would foster a sense of, again, we're still part of that wall, right? We are still also genealogically close to properly to such great names like Charlemagne and their same father, after all, that was reflected all across the empire. Notoriously, the Carolingian bases of power by 843, so under Louis' reign, were concentrated in Bavaria, right? Regensburg was the most important court of Louis the German. And this had been also for the previous Carolingians in this part of the empire. We see Louis addressing from Regensburg documents to recipients scattered throughout the entire Eastern Frankish kingdom. The advantages were obvious, right? Regensburg was pretty much at the center of the system, located on the Danube. It allowed those to carry out those military operations in down river into the expanding eastern marks that were opening to the Franks some of the most strategically relevant and not actually poor lands across, in fact, the river. Right after the collapse, as you know, of the Auer Khaganate, there was really a lot of land that the Carolingians could grab, and that, generally speaking, the Ostsiedlung was just beginning to exploit in a concerted way at various levels of society, of ecclesiastical organization. I made a video about medieval Styria explaining this, but we have to come back potently on the larger Bavarian one, because, as you know, Bavaria would later on expand dramatically as a circumscription, encompassing this purple lots of lands that were to keep expanding towards that direction before the arrival of the Magyars, the other issues that followed. But the other important connection, of course, from Bavaria was with Italy. All these brothers were essentially trying to start to rule from the most prestigious kingdom, at least as far as the imperial title went. Right, the real center of Frankish power in terms of aristocratic clienteles was, of course, in the northeast of France, the Benelux areas, But of course, the most prestigious kingdom was still the Italic one, and Louis could, from Regensburg, like reach Italy through the Brenner Pass, and just having that capacity of strategic projection. Both, again, the eastern frontier was sort of a bit troubled, especially with the Slavs. We talked about the main polities existing on that eastern frontier at the time before the arrival of the Hungars. Another important advantage was the relatively easy connection with the Rhineland, right? Especially the upper Franconian area around Forchheim played an important role in this, right? The easiest, let's say, the most direct route from Regensburg to the Rhineland passed from there, and from further west, as we'll see, as the German tried, in fact, to interfere with the Western Frankish king. He invaded Aquitaine, and that's an interesting play within the Western Frankish kingdom that, yes, was more unitary, but was not fully, packed in that sense either, right? It was just so more in comparison to Eastern Francia. The expansion eastward from Bavaria was not, however, pressured too much by Louis, right? Mostly there was a spontaneous movement. At that point in the east, it wasn't even a major, this was the point, a major polity that could simply threaten strategically the Eastern Frankish kingdom. You had Bavarian missionaries and settlers that advanced steadily down the Danube into Pannonia. So it pushed this German frontier, if you want, continually towards mostly the southeast, right? And it would largely do this alone. Of course, they were protected by the aristocracy, but essentially most, as you know, the relations with the Western Slavs and the Magyars later were handled by the Bavarians, right? The Saxons too, because they were sort of at least the most, the militarized ducal reality after the end of the Carolingian Empire, being pressured, in fact, by the Slavs on the Elbe and also the Norse from Jutland. But overall, the unsung heroes of also the anti-Magyar fight and the sort of defense of the Eastern Frontier were actually the Bavarians, right? The Ottonian branch of Saxony succeeded clamorously from an imperial point of view, but in fact the same Bavarian branch of the Ottonians that was in the southeast of Germany didn't have that luxury, and unfortunately we lost so much also of the military history of the era that instead was quite intense. I mean, the Bavarians were just on the frontier. We're talking the 10th century in that case. Let's stick to our 9th. There was a general mentality already that fits completely with the one of the Ostsiedlung. Charlemagne himself had encouraged his subjects to literally take possessions of the lands in Pannonia, acquiring estates there. Again, the Avars had collapsed. This area was relatively wild, but also fairly centralized. There were historically, in fact, sedentary populations that had remained subject under these steppes rulers. So now the heavily militarized Carolingian elite could take advantage of that. Further east, you just had fundamentally the First Bulgarian Empire. In fact, was quite interested in the area, but the Franks, as far as this, especially Pannonia was concerned, had the upper hand. I made videos about all these populations. I made a video about the Pannonian Slavs, about the First Bulgarian Empire. We will hopefully go a bit more in depth with that. I just made a video about the Kingdom of Croatia, but there is the previous chapter about the duchy that also fits that sort of frontier area in the very south. All this Frankish expansion was reflected by, for example, the increase in the property of the church. Right, most of these movements were again directed through evangelization missions. So the Carolingians gradually increased their control on this Pannonian territory under Louis in a quite spontaneous way. The sort of more eccentric and sort of, for different reasons, distant lands in the Eastern Frankish kingdom from central power were Saxony and Alamannia, right? So about the former, I made a video probably about the Duchy of Saxony. I haven't made a video about the Old Saxons, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, some of them, again, the Alien, the Carolingian conquest of Saxony, etc., but we'll have to talk about them. Instead, about Alamannia, made multiple videos, both Alamannia and Swabia, that are technically the same thing, at least they would become known. Louis visited these countries less frequently. Only thrice, Saxony, 845, 51, and 52. He spent only a few weeks there out of his entire reign after 843. We're talking about 33 years, right, of reign. So these times were quite relevant as far as the sovereign figure stability could mold the country. Like the Saxony was left largely out because it was, again, sort of even the most depressed area. Let's be honest. It had important sort of moral load that, again, that primitiveness was still matching some aggressive manpower, militarized traditional mentality that, again, had been more difficult to fit within the Carolingian order, but it was growing thanks to that as well. And by the way, Louis went there every time there was some threat, right, from the local establishment as well. In other words, Saxon rebellions of sort, right? Otherwise, Louis himself was happy to leave Saxony alone, right? He, entrusted the local government, of course, to the ecclesiastical and lay nobility, but again, problems could always arise. Just Saxony didn't have such a great potential this time, so even the threats posed to the stability of the realm, just it was far north, but were not so great, especially considering you have a de facto capital, or at least a favored court in Regensburg. Alamannia was different because of all the chunks of the Frankish Empire from the previous centuries. It had been, yes, among some of the most primitive areas, but by this point it was part of the Carolingian heartland, was no foreign people, at least as a foreign threat around. It was very much in the heart of Europe between Gaul, Germany, and Italy. Its establishment was fully Christianized since the 8th century, right? So Alamannia/Swabia had a history of rebellion that would go on. Even, I don't know, the son of Otto I, famously as Duke of Swabia, rebelled to his father. It was an autonomistic interest from the side of this nobility. It was also quite rough and warlike. Later on, the Hohenstaufen would sort of embody, like, to peak, at least almost all the various stem duchies had their moment of greatest glory, and as you know, in German national history, Swabia is like the top of all because of their imperial journey later on. And yet it was peripheral in the sense that it didn't immediately connect the most important communication route of the empire. It was still considered as a sort of foreign land by the same Franks, right? Burgundy, for example, was less powerful than Alamannia, or at least it would have more. It was more composite, also from a cultural point of view. Was considered, especially in the continental part, much fully Frankish, right? In political alignment, the Alamannia had always been sort of another thing. And yet it was not a marginal land, right? It fit the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and it was necessary to connect Bavaria and the broader, in fact, Frankish heartland, also in the west. You couldn't ignore it, again, as far as the Italian policy was concerned as well. It was an important asset just altogether for the finishing to compact like this fairly squared landmass that the Eastern Frankish kingdom really was. So in the 50s, in the 60s of the 9th century, Louis took care of consolidating his position there, and he would do so mostly through the means of monasteries, right? For example, he placed 2 of his daughters in turn in the at the head of the convent for ladies at Zurich. That was a quite important, as you know, frontier area from the further, in fact, away Burgundian nobiliary interest, like of expanding around the Constance Lake area. We're talking about Hildegard, who died in 856, and Bertha, who died in 877. In other words, you couldn't touch that place because the daughters of the same king were there. There was also an important public tradition in Swabia, as far as at least the imperial palace at Ulm was concerned. Ulm would become, what very important symbol of the imperial power, especially during the Franconian era. The cathedral hosted the tombs of many emperors. It was destroyed during World War II, but the tombs are still there. So, as Eastern Frankish King Louis paid homage to this public tradition, this monarchic legacy, reinforcing his position in Swabia, right? In 859, however, he would finally resign from the title of Duke, and he entrusted it to his youngest son, Charles, so to in part grant a bit of autonomy to the Swabian establishment, but still leaving his offspring in the province. Under Louis the German, the clergy lost an important part of the influence that it had under his father, Louis the Pious. Right? We have 25 documents issued by the younger Louis before 840. 10 of these are addressed to Bavarian bishops alone. Other 9 were added up until his death in 876. But it's not too much, right? At least less than what he had been under his father. This mechanism is connected likely with the broader military interests of the sovereign. Again, the capacity of just recovering more power, also in, as we'll see now, his relatives' lands. Whereas under his grandfather and father, the main goal was internal consolidation, and the clergy would have had a critical role in that. It's not to say that the bishops were not important, right? But their influence as a whole was clearly declining everywhere in the Western Frankish kingdom, except for Bavaria. They still, of course, needed that greater, also spiritual concentration necessary to support the ruler. He could have summoned synods of the whole kingdom, but he deliberately didn't do this. There is just an instance in which Rabban Maur acceded to the bishopric of Mainz, and thus the Eastern Frankish synod became active. Right, this was a very important, as you know, spiritual figure. He was, in fact, Bishop of Mainz, one of the most important cities in Franconia. But looking at his episcopal successors, Charles from 856 to 63, and Luthbert 863-89, you can easily see how this synodic activity lost its impulse first and then it died away altogether. Right. Admittedly, again, the Eastern Frankish situation was sort of more complicated, also for the ecclesiastical development and ecclesiastical episcopal hierarchies, and so it was more difficult just to have, as we've seen, a broader interconnection of all the various provinces in the first place. So this card was evidently seen as too costly, perhaps, for Louis, that had much more concrete interests, as we'll see now, politically and expansionistically. There is, of course, an important clergy gravitating around Louis. Like, this was normal, of course, for a Carolingian ruler anyway, right? He saw them as private advisors rather than the expression of their relative institutions anyway, which is also quite meaningful, meaning that the latter were also seeking royal support to grow actually more power. Again, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, there was less concentrated power at every level of the hierarchy, right? Incomparably with Western Francia, for example. So these guys were also seeking for some more direct royal protection, not just for increasing their power locally, but literally because they had less security in general. Rabban Maur, again, is the first figure. Then we have Charles and Luthbert, as far as Mainz is concerned. We have Ermenrich of Passau. He died in 874. The diocese of Passau was quite critical for the organization of the aforementioned Christianization across the Eastern Mark. These guys gravitated around Louis. We see abbatial figures even more important than episcopal ones, or one of the cathedrals. This is again quite relevant because the Eastern Frankish kingdom was much more rurally based, so cities were less developed, and the bishops as a consequence could be easily less powerful than abbots in comparison again to the other Carolingian regions. Bishops, however, for this reason, and since of course the diocesan administration was necessary to centralize from the very towns, were put in charge of some major royal monasteries, which was a way of endowing them with further properties, like at least administering them. And this was, after all, a continuity of Louis' fathers and grandfathers' policy regarding attempting, however, to make the clergy sustaining some sort of concentrated power, administrative net, right? And of course this would work in the later centuries, also in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, right? Lay abbots were less important in Louis' kingdom. This is also interesting because it shows, after all, that he didn't indulge too much in the support of the laity where it was not needed. You know, that the Carolingian Empire, there were also some literal natural sons of Charlemagne, such as there were important lay abbots, which means that they had this commission, like this title for essentially administering this local abbeys, but they had a completely lay lifestyle. They were knights. Nithard, famously enough, this guy was killed in Aquitaine during a Viking raid, and he also left us a very interesting history, right, of his era, the one we're talking about here. So that is somehow typical of Carolingian practice, especially in these more eastern territories. But the greatest interest of Louis, obviously, predictably enough, and again, was the one for the rest of the Carolingian lands, and especially the ones overall north of the Alps, so essentially Western Francia and the Middle Kingdom, that became known as Lotharingia. This was absolutely obvious, normal, and intelligent, pragmatic to do. Again, the Frankish heartland, as far as the military imperial power was concerned, was definitely this land, again, in the northern part of the Western Frankish kingdom, and parts of the Middle Kingdom. There were, of course, important centers in the same Eastern Frankish part. Cologne had been sort of the ancestral area as a broader province to the Carolingians themselves. That wasn't much the point, right? Most of the power was concentrated in Neustria, right? And as a consequence, every time Charles the Bald was seen as, the rule of Western Francia was seen as weak, like sort of wavering in power, such as it happened in 854, 58, and after 870. Louis tried to gain a foothold even in the far west, not even just trying, in fact, the toughest part, the hardest core, as we were saying, where most of the, in fact, Frankish power was glued in. And after all, let's say, eccentric territories, part of which, compared to, the Frankish heartland, including some of which he was using, like a crown around, in fact, Neustria, and parts of Austrasia that he didn't control, would do, like to surround, to also sever, for example, from Italy and the imperial crown, his rival, his counterpart, right? For example, the Robertines, from which they would, as you know, become counts of Paris, and later you have the Capetians stemming from the same branch, and the Rorgonids from Men, sought Louis help to the point of inviting him to take over the Western Frankish kingdom altogether, right, to be elected king in Charles' stead. So Louis, first of all, sent his son and namesake to Aquitaine. This is relevant, again, because he had to cross, other Frankish land, including some territories that were some more or less at least reclaimable by Charles, that had his own problems, but Aquitaine was, as you know, a bit more it's an Occitanian land. They had never quite liked too much the Franks, and that was a way to, the eastern ones are too far from creating problems, let's make a mess. I made a video about the Duchy of Aquitaine that practically exemplifies the story of continuous self-sabotage of the broader system. It's quite fascinating, especially at this point in the second half of the 9th century. However, that expedition would not achieve much. The same can be said for the one that Louis the German himself led in 858. He literally invaded Charles, it was his brother, by the way, kingdom, at the head of an Eastern Frankish army. Under his command, he failed as his son. What happened at that point is that Ingmar of Rhem, and we saw how important that city was, not just for the Frankish, say, mystique and sort of all the ancestral meaning of the Frankish spiritual roots, but just also strategically, in the later century, for example, for those videos about the Eastern Frankish campaigns under the Ottonians against the Western Franks, the guy called up all the Western Franks to resist this, say, foreign invasion, because in part it would be seen as that. Again, the army of Louis could have been Carolingian, of course, in a dynastic sense, but again, there were all these other people's contingents, like including one of populations that had fought against the Western Franks themselves back in the day, resisting the invasion. The reason why Ingmar was so zealous, by the way, about supporting Charles at this point was quite conveniently, and this tells you also how the Carolingian Empire fell apart, the fact that since the division in three of the empire, Rome was the most important archiepiscopal metropolis see in the Western Frankish kingdom. So he was essentially the most important spiritual figure in the West, and if the empire had been made all one, probably he would have lost that privilege in a broader sense. So he preferred to carve his own thing at the expense of the bigger system, resisting the reunification, let's say, than in fact losing this opportunity. As a consequence, in 859, Louis the German was forced to withdraw hurriedly from Western Francia. Overall, when you look at these expeditions, you realize that there wasn't really a sort of major mobilization or sort of, say, protracted effort of, say, Eastern Francia to go against Western Francia, right? This was virtually unthinkable, right? The Carolingians were in many ways losing control on their territories. What they could hope was essentially to dynastically substitute themselves to their siblings and sort to achieve, again, a accumulation of territorial, of recognized territorial control that would allow them, wherever they were located, to concentrate more resources, right? But not really having a sound grasp or being able to mobilize the entire system just to fight these terrible wars within these various tribes, right? Don't get me wrong; these clashes were pretty bloody, right? But they were trying, of course, to carry them out in a sort of surgical way, given that everything revolved around the dynastic right, the God-given one of the Carolingian blood to rule over the other people in the world. Without mentioning that the Eastern Frankish kingdom was involved in pretty intense defense of its own boundaries from external foes. I mean, the Slavs, as we've seen, were not particularly united. The Magyars were not around yet, but different groups would still enter territory, raiding, sacking. That they had to be stabilized. The rulers across the frontier had to be tamed. It was particularly difficult as long, especially as they were so divided. That's how, I don't know, the Bohemians, for example, were sort of co-opted as a duchy. At this point in their history, made multiple videos about that to sort of fit more the Eastern Frankish order, so much so that half of a millennium later, Bohemia was fully integrated de facto within the German system, even though, of course, it's a Slavic country, but institutionally so, as a royal elector. It began at this point, right? But the capacity, even just of pushing the subjects to fight, was on a large scale was unthinkable by that point, because the locals would actually fight a lot, even just among each other, the various aristocratic rivalries, and again, as we've seen, revolts to the even royal authority, etc. But they were mostly spent locally by these guys to entrench again further in their own privileges more than else. And that's how the Carolingian Empire fell apart. These clashes between brothers did not really help either. Actually, they weakened the entire system, especially when they began to throw Vikings against one another. Today we skip this entire picture. Today we do not talk about the Slavic frontier, we do not talk about the Viking incursions, but there was lots of stuff going on, and so, everything, you can feel that sense of precarity that as rulers, they would feel pretty well when they had to politically control the territory, and it was quite complicated. Even in Bavaria, that, as we have seen, was at the center, after all, of the Eastern Frankish kingdom's establishment and governmental control, the local inhabitants didn't seem particularly taken care of, right? Consider also the mentality. I mean, the Carolingians didn't really concede these local subjects on these various peoples like as particularly close to them, right? And especially so in a broader sense, especially as they were forcing the aristocracy to gain ever greater control. It was a bigger game, like a Europe-wide scale, and as such, the average, say, the person in these lands thought was not that relevant, and they had, in fact, their own problems, that they were losing significantly their liberty during these times. A much spicier event was the death of Lothar I in 856, right? So this was, again, one of the original brothers that had partitioned the empire, right? And from which Louis had gotten his Eastern Frankish side, right? Lothar was succeeded by his sons, who ruled. This was the other thing that didn't help much the unity of the Carolingian Empire. Of course, the perennial Frankish division of their father's possession. Right, doesn't matter how they were trying to concentrate at least most power into the senior line. Still, they were pretty much about we must split this equally. Right. So what happened is that among Lothar's sons, Louis received the Italic kingdom, and with that went the imperial crown as well to him. Right. Lothar instead got the lands north of the Alps, so the ones stretching from the mountains up to the North Sea, while Charles got Burgundy and Provence. You immediately understand the various chunks. I mean, this is how they would sort of logically work, right? You have the Italian side, you have the Lotharingian side, and the Provençal Burgundian side. The point, however, is that none of these children would be succeeded in turn by their own sons, right? So what happened in practice is that this weakened, first of all, their position, and their uncles, right? So Charles and Louis would look at them like at these realms in a quite cupid fashion. They wanted to simply take them over, right? And this is how, at least for Lotharingia, it would happen. Like, it would eventually go to the Eastern Frankish kingdom. We were talking about it just the other day about medieval Brabant. Lothar II, especially, was in fact at the head of this land, right? The name of Lotharingia, coming from the name of, officially in Latin, of Regnum Hlothari, Hlothari genitive. And this area was, if you want, the least coherent of all, because it sort of did not, it was open. There wasn't really a major, yes, there were major riverways flowing into the North Sea, but again, there's not a major boundary, this Atlantic plains, right? And all around, also the frontier was sort of less defined than, say, the one of the Italic kingdom or Provence and parts of Burgundy, as they had historically been, right? It was a novelty, right? And it led to a paralysis of the local government, also for dynastic and political reasons. In fact, Lothar II had married Theodberga, who was barren, right? And Lothar actually procreated a number of children with whom was considered an illegitimate wife, a Valdrada, right? So even though they had managed to generate an offspring, the church was contrary to this union, and this was naturally weaponized politically, right? At least a king without a legitimate son was immediately seen, especially at this stage of Carolingian history, as a weak ruler, whose realm would have just been partitioned later on, and so plans were made in order to carry that out, perhaps even before his demise. And this, by the way, was quite a drama, especially for Theodberga, who was literally removed from his side, and a Lotharingian synod of the entire land was convened, granting at least a divorce on the grounds that Theodberga had been unfaithful as well. So she was really unlucky and mistreated, to the point that since she also came from a very powerful family, she managed to receive the support of Charles the Bald, that again was looking at Lotharingia with interest. Charles had taken the matter in his own hands, however not before having consulted himself with his learned bishops that examined the situation from again a matrimonial point of view. And Charles the Bald, with Theodberga, appealed to the Pope to have a definitive, essentially, excommunication of Lothar. And that was desperate, by the way, of this, because he realized now that things had gone wrong, and he hoped at least to gain. His situation was weakening, so he was searching essentially for the protection of either of his uncles, and there was all enticement with Louis, especially. Lothar offered him Alsace altogether, like saying, if you recognize me as a rightful ruler of Lotharingia, you can have this piece of a significant piece of land. But nor Charles nor Louis were actually convinced by this. They knew that they could get much more just by seizing his territory. At that point, Nicholas I excommunicated Lothar's concubine, Valdrada. Regina of Prum gives us the Ternisi obstinato animo in maeche volutabro perenniter permanere proposuisset, right? Which basically means, because of this, of Valdrada's obstinate determination to remain wallowing in the mire of fornication. At the synod in Rome in 865, Pope Nicholas I went further ahead, depriving the Bishop Gunther of Cologne and Thietgout of Trier of their offices because they had supported their king. So of course this had a lot to do with Lothar's and Louis rivalry, because that area of the Rhineland was actually, and further inland, I mean Trier too, well, we are exactly on the frontier, right, between Lotharingia and the Eastern Frankish area. So this was helping locally Louis power to prevail, right? Here you see, of course, politics, like bishops do different things independently from, their, say, kingdom's direction, their king's direction, to be more concrete. Hadrian II would succeeded Nicholas I on St. Peter's throne, remained firm with this decision towards Valdrada and against Lothar, which tells you how dynastic this mechanism is, and how much, I made a video about Louis' son Charles III, about his reign and his relation with Rome specifically, how much the papacy could control of both this nascent German and French realities, right? There were literally two parties in Rome, one pro the Western Franks and one pro the Eastern Franks, And in fact, the Roman nobility factions were quite involved in this imperial dimension, universal one as well, and how much these rulers, of course, relied on the Pope to determine who had the right to rule in the first place. After all, they had set themselves, as Carolingians, this habit of being crowned Roman Emperor by the Pope's hand and not by their own, right? There had been some swing at the very beginning of this, but I made multiple videos on that, and Charlemagne, Louis the Pious, and how the papacy was firmly set as the arbiter, right, of imperial rule already at this point, in spite of all the ambiguities, what had not been clearly defined regarding the temporal, spiritual boundary in actual government, etc. But in this case, you see that essentially the Lotharingian ruler is undermined just because the Pope decided so. In fact, Lothar II was not faring particularly well at this point. The Norse were acting as allies of the Western and the Eastern Franks in tormenting Lotharingia, right? So again, something that did not really work, say, perfectly for the solidity of hopefully reconnectable, reunitable Carolingian Empire, but that sort of made sense. You know, you want this guy to give up, send the Vikings, ask the Vikings, like literally to channel their force there instead than your own land, because you know you wouldn't intervene and you would be actually supporting them in the process. So that's how politics was made, and it is still made, telling the truth. Nothing has really changed. Nothing can change, and it's all like there is an intelligence behind this. Again, we are habituating to thinking, oh my god, these politicians that want war, whatever, it's bad because the common people. But of course, there are better, worse decisions regarding what that counts. But you know, it's just, like, in fact, a continuation of politics. And if you do not understand politics, if you don't see the sense in it, it's just because you're out of it. Or at least you live in the world determined by this, but you have not enough power because you're not enough yourself. And this is what these rulers understood adamantly, and just like power has always understood. So the world developed, after all, throughout all this, or even in great part thanks to this, for the worse and the better. But that's perhaps a topic for a more politically theoretical discussion, not this one. I think it is important to have talk about Eastern Francia. If you look at my playlist, I talked a lot about the Carolingians, and we have really lots of stuff uploaded so far about them. Here, Carolingian Empire, 57 videos, right? Even more about the Franks. But here, aside from the fact that I see only 800 views of the playlist, of course the videos have more views each, but sort of like the sense that I haven't made enough, right, in basic Frankish and Carolingian history is evident. Well, actually, especially for the Merovingians, but still, we had to get a bit more into the territorial, political, hardcore specificities of this reign. So today I was very happy to have finally made a video about Eastern Francia, because it's really an important land. As you know, we discussed it in various videos also for the 10th century and beyond, like our videos about medieval Germany. There are many pertinent videos here and there, but they are not specifically dedicated to this topic, right, to this realm. And the, of course, purpose of Schwerpunkt is to cover all the various realms, right, all the various reigns of the single rulers as well. Just the other day we were making that video about Lothar III and Conrad III's Italic reigns. So the idea is understanding, of course, how interconnected Europe was, and how basically everything that we discuss in these videos comes back in a way or another, right? Just what we discussed today, I don't know, emerges in other hundreds of videos, to say the least. And one must look at the specificities of the places, of the people of the time, but also being able to reconnect in them. Otherwise, it doesn't make a sense to study history in the first place, right? Very well, so for today, however, I stop it here. This was not a definitive video about also Louis' reign, so we've just observed some aspects of that. We will surely look at others, and one of our other rulers. However, for today it's all. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.